All right, here we go with Chapter 16, Language, Culture, and English Language Learners. The outcomes for the chapter: explain the ways in which children differ from one another according to their culture and language, in addition to any possible learning or developmental disabilities. Identify appropriate assessment procedures for students with language differences. Describe effective instructional practices for students with dialectical differences, English language learners, and English language learners with disabilities. All right, so language and cultural diversity. Language unites groups of people and helps them form a common identity. Culture also influences language. So language can influence culture, and culture can influence language. Children who speak a dialect other than quote-unquote standard English or English language learners may have cultural differences that can also impact their ability to be understood and accepted by mainstream culture. So language and culture often goes hand in hand. Each of these can make it harder or easier for all of us to communicate what we mean with one another. So you can have, the example your book uses is that Chinese American children can become easily embarrassed when receiving praise. So you might have, students who are quiet or, don't really feel great about getting praise, whereas other kids would be more talkative and happy if they got praise. That can be a big factor too. So again, differences are not just about dialect or language, it's also about culture. Many people in the U.S. speak a language other than the dominant language of their region. And for educators, SLPs, audiologists, having an awareness of cultural differences and respect for different cultural values is an important first step in building a functional classroom environment, right? So, some dialect differences. Number one, we can have a regional dialect, which is a variant of a particular language. Dialects share most of the features of the main language, but differ in pronunciation, vocabulary, and or stylistic features. But again, dialects can be really different. There are some really cool YouTubes that are about the Scottish dialect that you might want to check out, right? Because in America, we like to talk about our own dialects, but it's important to remember that dialects are everywhere. And it can be, sometimes they can be really hard to understand going from dialect to dialect. And there is no one right way to talk, right? All of us talk differently based on where we're from, who we are, what culture we adopt. There's not one right way to talk. There's not one right way to act necessarily, right? We can also have a social dialect, right? So there are regional dialects and there are social dialects. So a way of speaking that's associated with a particular social group. Some social dialects carry with them the stigma of discrimination and the belief that some are inferior versions of English, right? So again, we get this idea that there's a right way to talk and there's some sort of a hierarchy in how we talk, how we write, how we sound, right? But that's not really true. African American English, which has been known by lots of names, is a dialect of English used by some African American speakers and also by some non-African American speakers, right? If you grow up around a lot of people who speak African American English, you may well speak African American English in some form, even if you're non-African American. It's going to be characterized by differences in phonology, syntax, pragmatics, and aspects of conversational discourse, just like every other dialect. Some unique features include deletion or substitution. I've got these here. We've got deletion of past tense ending. So you can just drop that ed sometimes for past tense. Especially if you're obviously talking about the past, right? There's no reason to necessarily also have the ed. Variation in past tense of irregular verbs, right? So just going ahead and making words, just changing the irregulars. Use of double negatives is going to be more common. Use of the be verb as the main verb. Deletion of final s in third person singular present tense, and also deletion of final s if we're talking about either possessive tense or plural, sometimes two, right? It often the speaker and the listener can understand very easily what is being said without the additional sounds at the end. So a lot of our word endings in English are superfluous, right? If you know you're already in past tense anyway, you don't necessarily need the ed. If you're talking about, if you're going to Mary's house and you say, I'm going to Mary house, you know what the person's saying, right? So those are just some of the differences. Code switching. So the phenomenon in which people switch from one language or one dialect to another. One example I gave in class was that I remember hearing an African American professor talking, and she was saying how, all day long at work with students, with other faculty members, she would use quote unquote standard American English, and she would be exhausted by the time she got home, right? That she would, because she grew up using African American English, so she would have to code switch, she would have to talk differently all day long, and she'd be really tired when she got home from all that extra work. And it really made me think about, I have times when I want to be more fluent or less fluent as a person who stutters, and if I take a lot of time working to be fluent, so I sound quote unquote normal, quote unquote typical, whatever, it can be really exhausting. So that really made a lot of sense to me, that it would be really tiring for her to speak in a certain way that's not natural for her. So the individual is aware of the environmental conditions that affect the choices of language, right? You feel like you have to speak a certain way, you have to sound a certain way to be accepted by society, right? So your book talks about standard dialects and non-standard dialects, but it's also important to look at this comes from Cambridge University Press, talking about there's no such thing as standard English, right? So there's not one standard English, and even if you say there's a standard English, right? There's a standard British English, a standard American English, a standard Australian English, a standard South African English, standard Irish English, standard Canadian English, right? But then all of these are also going to have dialects within all of them. So, it's all dialects, it's all variations. And, so there really is no such thing as a standard, other than, right, it's the people who are in power who get to say, hey, the way we talk is the right way. Everyone else talks the wrong way, right? So we all just have different variations of English that we're all speaking, right? However, right, your book does talk about standard American English. So 3 reasons why educators are concerned about children who use non-standard English dialects. Number 1, it interferes with the student's academic progress, right? But that's really related to the second one, right? So competency in oral standard English is necessary for students to learn to write standard English. Right. So that is an idea, right? So that first one, it interferes with academic progress, right? That's really based on writing, right? That what we read, what we write, is generally supposed to be in standard English, and so it can be harder for people who don't speak standard English to then read and write standard English. And then the last idea, right? Standard English is necessary for vocational success and in other areas in which non-standard dialect speakers are branded as uneducated and ill-prepared, right? Is that you can certainly argue though, right? Is that the problem of the speaker, or is that the problem of the person who's actually judging the speaker? And I think we've certainly come a long way in being less judgmental as a society, but we still certainly have a long way to go. So, again, being able to code switch is probably valuable, but also realizing that, if you're worried about somebody being judged, we also need to focus on the people judging that person, and not just trying to change the person who's going to be judged, right? So this is a map about just those regional dialects we're talking about, but right, there are also a million different types of dialects within these. We have a different dialect up here in Boone. It's more of an Appalachian Southern dialect than you would get in Charlotte. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. There are 4 or 5 fairly distinct dialects in the Philadelphia area, right? So I grew up saying Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I'd ask for a glass of water. Right. So we all have, this map's a very generalized thing where we have lots of different ways, right? So again, especially in cities like Philly, New York, and Boston, there are lots and lots of dialects. You go into a different neighborhood and you're speaking a different dialect. According to ASHA, each dialect is adequate as a functional and an effective variety of American English, that dialect differences are not a sign of a language disorder. And it's really important for SLPs to be able to distinguish children who talk differently from children who have an actual language disorder, right? But because of, we as SLPs aren't great at cultural differences, and then also the assessment tools that we use are also not great. So kids who speak different dialects are going to be more likely to be under-referred or over-referred. So you'll get more kids referred as having a disorder who don't have one, and you'll get more kids who do not have or who do have a disorder not being referred, right? So it's really important that we have a good understanding of, all right, what's a dialect, what are the dialect differences, and then what are the actual disorders. All right, then we get to English language learners. These are students who speak another language other than English, who are in the process of acquiring English as a second or additional language, and who have not yet achieved full English proficiency. Some English language learners are mislabeled as having learning disabilities or emotional behavioral disorders and are inappropriately placed in special education. So again, the same issue here with English language learners that we do with people speaking different dialects, that people who do not need to be referred and in therapy end up in therapy. People who do need therapy end up not being in therapy. And then we've got the idea of bilingualism, ability to understand and use 2 languages. Right. Also, people can understand and use a lot more than 2, but we'll just talk about bilingualism. This ranges from minimal ability to complete fluency in more than 1 language. And we've got the 2 main kinds of bilingualism that we need to know about and think about are going to be simultaneous bilinguals individuals who begin learning 2 languages at the same time. Typical of families with parents, guardians, grandparents who speak different languages. So they grow up in a house speaking English and Spanish or French and Spanish or whatever. And then also sequential subsequent bilinguals. So individuals who learn one language at birth and then begin learning a second language early in life, so before they become a teenager. So, and sometimes people ask why there's not more research on bilingualism in our field, but it's such a complicated idea, right? So number one, everybody who's bilingual is going to be in a different place, but well, not everybody, right? You've got people who speak 2 languages really fluently, understand it fluently, but then you've got people that speak one language and understand one language very well, and are minimally fluent in another language. Are they bilingual? You've got people who grew up, right, as simultaneous bilinguals speaking 2 or more languages right from the beginning. You've got kids who learn one pretty well, and then maybe they're thrown into another language and only speak that other language and start to lose the other language. So they're not great at either language because they're only halfway through in both of them. So everybody who's bilingual, unless you're really, really fluent in both, is going to be at a very different place. So it's very hard to do research on people when we pretend that they're this group. This group is bilingual, but that can mean so many different things. ELLs and Literacy. So English language learners have been found to lag behind their peers in the development of academic skills, especially literacy skills. The age of oral proficiency in English was directly correlated with English language learners' development of reading and writing in English. There's a close relationship between spoken language and reading and writing, right? So this can be a big deal, right? If you're an English language learner, but you start learning that second language in preschool, in kindergarten, right, and you start getting in on right when you're learning to read, learning the sounds, that's usually a really good time to learn that second language, because you'll learn to read and write and do everything in that second language, and that's great, right? But if you don't start learning that second language till 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, right, your peers are already well ahead of you in reading, writing, speaking that language. You're behind, so that can be really difficult. And here's this, right? So English language learners who were not proficient in spoken English by 1st grade lagged behind their peers in reading to a greater extent than those who were proficient in English by 1st grade. Knowledge of English vocabulary has been found to have to be a really important predictor of reading success, right? So if you have a good vocabulary in the language in which you're reading, obviously you're going to be able to read and understand what you read a lot better if you know the vocabulary words. Things like cultural factors and educational quality are also going to play a big role in literacy skills. You've also got, right, some English language learners who have significant problems in learning, socialization, and or behavior and require special education services. Right, so then these kids are both ELL and have either a learning disability, language disability, something else. And then there might also be cultural differences that impact things. So, right, it can just get a little bit more complicated, and we have to be, as communication disorder specialists and really communication specialists, we have to have a good understanding of all these different factors. So a challenge for educators is going to be appropriately identifying these students. All right, so how do we do an appropriate assessment? Children from different ethnic, cultural, or economic backgrounds may perform poorly on tests because they lack experience with the test format or stimuli. This makes it difficult to distinguish between children whose language differences reflect their differing experiences and backgrounds and children who have fundamental language disorders, right? So it's really important to give these kids, if we can, a standardized test, if it's going to be meaningful at all. However, we have to do a lot more than that because these tests have been standardized on kids who, the vast majority of them are not English language learners. The vast majority of them are not going to have the different ethnic, cultural, or economic background of that child in front of you. So we can use the standardized tests as a tool to help them to help them qualify for services, to learn more about specific things that they have trouble with or strengths with, but we need to do a lot more than that. So norm reference tests have problems that affect the accuracy of their use with children from diverse language and cultural backgrounds. These problems include content, linguistic bias, and disproportionate representation in normative samples of students with limited English proficiency, right? So that kid in front of you is not who that test was normed on. The IDEA contains provisions that spell out the obligations of schools to conduct non-biased assessments while evaluating children for special education services, right? And of course, there's no such thing as a non-biased assessment, right? We all know that everything is biased, right? All people are biased in some way. All assessments are biased, but we want to try to reduce the bias as much as we can. Testing and evaluation materials and procedures used for the purposes of evaluation and placement of handicapped children must be selected and administered so as not to be racially or culturally discriminatory, right? And again, we want to try to lessen these factors as much as possible, and knowing that this racial discrimination, cultural discrimination, language discrimination does exist and is real. Testing and evaluation materials and procedures must be provided and administered in the language or other mode of communication in which the child is most proficient, unless it's clearly impossible to do so, right? So we need to try to either get the testing materials in the language the child speaks, or to get a speaker of that language in the testing room with us to help translate. Tests must be administered to a child with motor, speech, hearing, visual, or other communication disability, or to a bilingual child to reflect the child's ability accurately in the area tested, rather than testing their limited English skills, unless those are the factors being tested, right? So we're not really testing their English language ability. We need to be testing their overall language ability. So commonly used accommodations for English language learners: bilingual dictionaries and glossaries, Spanish versions of the assessment if it's a Spanish child, speaking child, right? Extra time, simplified English, English dictionaries and glossaries to help everybody understand, dual language booklets and test items. A few of the language tests that we give now do have a Spanish version that we can give. Kiefer and colleagues found that only simplified English and English dictionaries and glossaries were generally effective in improving the performance of ELL students. So helping them to be able to, like the student, the SLP can stop, can look words up, talk about words. Payen suggested a 7-step process for the assessment of ELL students being evaluated for special education services: referral, parent interview, assessment of language proficiency, determining the language needed for the assessment, an in-depth analysis of the child's native language abilities, a similar assessment of their English language skills, And then finally, the clinician summarizing the results and making recommendations. So, right, one of the great ways to do this, right, is that, really getting to know the parents well, interviewing the parents, and then also trying to do an in-depth analysis of their first language abilities, right? So what is that child's, if it's a child whose first language is Spanish, right? What are their Spanish language abilities? And then what are their English language abilities? All right, so one great way to do assessments with these kids will be through a dynamic assessment. And dynamic assessments have been used successfully for English language learners and other kids with cultural or linguistic differences. Dynamic assessments evaluate how children learn during the assessment process. Dynamic assessments measure how much a student can actually learn. Right, so you're not necessarily measuring what children know right now. You're measuring how much they are able to learn. So we've got 3 major steps in implementing the model. Number 1, testing the limits. The goal is to find out what children really know and can do. So what do they know right now? Are they able to explain what they know right now? Graduated prompting. Responses are elicited through the use of increasingly more specific prompts. The child's readiness to learn specific target items is determined by the level of prompting needed, right? So how much prompting and support does a child need to complete a task? Right? The more help they need, obviously, we're reaching sort of the limit of what they're able to do. And then the idea of test, teach, retest. So initial testing is used to determine what the child does and does not know. Then we're going to do a short intervention focused on unknown items, and then we're going to retest the child to see whether they have acquired the newly taught information. So are they able to learn English, certain English patterns or abilities quickly? If they can, right, that's going to tell us maybe this isn't a language disorder, maybe this is just a English language learner issue. So using dynamic assessments is one really good way to test these kids.